Hi, thank you guys for showing up today. So this is our third expert series talks, and today we're going to have Rachel Wigginton joining us today, who will be presenting on her research. So a little bit of background about Rachel. She is a senior environmental scientist at the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy. It is one of the state of California's 10 conservancies. As part of the Delta Conservancy mission to lead efforts to protect, enhance, and restore the Delta's environment, Dr. Wigginton facilitates the Delta in Interagency in Invasive Species Coordination, so the DIISC team. The DIISC team seeks to forest communications and collaboration among California state's agencies, federal agencies, research and conservation groups, and other stakeholders that detect, protect, and manage invasive species and restore invasive habitats in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. Before coming to the Delta Conservancies, Rachel completed her PhD in ecology at UC Davis, studying the impacts of invasive plants in tidal wetlands. And I do want to add a little bit more to that because when I started doing research back like 10 years ago, that's how I met Rachel. And she kind of got me, pumped up in doing research. So I definitely did learn a lot from Rachel. So I'm like super excited that she's able to join us here today to present some of her research.
Thank you, Anita, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And I can't believe it's been 10 years since we met. That is a long time. And I was in graduate school for most of those 10 years. So I'm glad to kind of be on the other side of that. So as Anita said, my name's Rachel, and today I'm going to be talking about early detection and rapid response to invasive species in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy. I know that the past couple speakers in this expert series for this summer have talked a lot about their experimental research. And what I'm going to be talking about today is a lot more about applied ecology and how we can take some of our research findings and apply those to management needs or management concerns. All right. There we go. Excellent. All right, so just a little bit more context about who I am. I think Anita gave a great introduction, but as she said, I'm a senior environmental scientist at the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy, which is a California state agency that works in coordination with local communities to protect, enhance, and restore the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta's economy, agricultural and working landscapes, and environment. And in my training in graduate school, I am a wetland scientist and a restoration ecologist. And a lot of my past research has focused on tidal wetland invasive plants, specifically thinking about invasive Lepidium latifolium, which is shown here on the left-hand side, that invades the higher elevation areas of tidal wetlands, as well as invasive hybrid spartina, which invades the lower elevation areas of those wetlands. And that's what I really focused on during my time as a research wetland scientist. And what I was really interested in there, not just understanding better how these invasive plants can impact these systems, but also really answering questions of applied ecology, which focuses on the application of ecological knowledge to address environmental challenges. So in this case, if we want to manage or control an invasive species, applied ecology would ask, like, how will the removal of those invasive species impact other native species? How can we go about our control and maybe restoration programs in the most efficient manner? And I've taken that interest forward into my work at the Delta Conservancy, which really focuses on collaborative science in the Delta. So there are a lot of really broad problems that apply in lots of ecology, but particularly in my system in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, that involve a lot of different players. So a lot of different government agencies, both federal and state, nonprofit organizations, and just like interested community members who are really interested in our natural systems and the services and the functions that they provide. So really focused on how do we address these big complicated problems with applied ecology. So just like a quick overview of what I'm going to discuss today, I'm hoping to help you understand specifically the importance of early detection and rapid response to invasive species. And I'm going to start by giving you a little context for the Delta as a system. I'm going to discuss some common Delta invaders. I'm going to introduce the Delta Interagency Invasive Species Coordination Team, which Anita gave a little bit of an overview of already, before really diving into an overview of what early detection and rapid response is, why it's useful, and then some illustrative examples of how we have applied these ideas in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. So just to zoom back and give you a little bit of the landscape context of where this work is happening. This is in the San Francisco Bay Delta estuary, which is one of the largest estuaries in the United States. It's on the west coast here in California, where I am speaking to you from today. And for those who maybe are a little bit less familiar, estuaries are places where fresh water from the land mixes with salt water from the ocean, which is pushed inland by tidal forces. And it really, in the San Francisco Bay, is shown in this map here to the right. And just to further orient you, you have Sacramento, so the state capital, up here in the north, and San Francisco down here on the west, right next to the Golden Gate. And a good way to think about the San Francisco Bay Delta estuary is that it's a series of bays meeting an inverted river delta. So we have the tidal forces coming in through the Golden Gate and going down into the San Francisco Bay and the south and central portion of the western part of the estuary, up into San Pablo Bay, and then east through Grizzly Bays and Sassoon Bay, where we have the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River coming together at their confluence, which is to the east of Sassoon Bay. And if we focus in just a little bit more on the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, so what we might refer to as the upper San Francisco Bay estuary, this is an inverted river delta. So if you think about your classic, perhaps, example of a river delta from North America, the Mississippi River Delta, where the rivers spread out as they approach the coast, this is sort of the opposite of that, where we have our rivers coming together at a confluence as they approach the coast through Sassoon Marsh and the San Francisco Bay. And historically, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, or just the Delta for the rest of the talk, was a mosaic of aquatic and semi-aquatic habitats, which are shown on the map here to the right, which was modified from a really great publication by Whipple in 2014 for the San Francisco Estuary Institute. And what this map shows is the historic distribution of habitat types in the Delta in the early 1800s. And you can see it's predominated by tidal and non-tidal freshwater emergent wetlands, which are shown on the map in that lighter shade of blue. So this is the habitat composition in the early 1800s, but essentially since the time of colonization, humans have been modifying the Delta, and today it is largely modified for agricultural production, which can be seen really clearly in the map to the right, which has shifted from that light blue to this pink, which represents areas that are in agricultural production. And another way to visualize this change in ecosystem type is in the stacked bar graphs to the left. So on the y-axis, you have 0 to 100%. And then the little stacks are the different percentages of the habitat types across the landscape. So on the left-hand bar, you see in the early 1800s that the proportion of those tidal and freshwater emergent wetlands in the light blue really predominate the system, whereas on the right, which is from the early 2000s, we see the system is really dominated by this agricultural production. And being a highly modified system, in addition to being an estuary, makes the delta particularly vulnerable to invasion. So this idea that invasions are quite common in estuaries comes from several different aspects of estuarine ecology. So estuaries are highly connected systems, which you can see very clearly in this map to the right. So in the map, you see San Pablo Bay on the left and the delta on the right with Sassoon Marsh in the middle. The reds and oranges over the bay represent areas of higher salinity, while the greens and blues over the delta and Sassoon Marsh show areas of decreasing salinity. So you can really clearly see the mixing of the different salinities of water, creating a gradient from west to east, from saline to less saline. And this connectedness is one of the reasons that estuaries are inherently at risk for introduction of non-native species. They're also landscape catchments, so meaning they are collecting at lower elevations across the landscape, and that collection can be things like runoff, litter, or even a non-native species that is growing in someone's backyard that's washed down during a large rain event and enters into the system. There are several other factors that facilitate invasion and introduction of new species into the delta. And these include things like ballast water pathways through the San Francisco Bay. So large ships coming up from the ocean through the bay all the way up into the ports of Stockton can potentially carry invasive species. Habitat restructuring that's happened, which we talked about before, but specifically to support land and water use in the delta. So in some ways, making the delta even more connected. Recreational boating and fishing can also lead to introductions of non-native species, as well as horticultural and pet industries, and just many other vectors of invasion. So because of these reasons, the Bay Delta estuary is known to be one of the most invaded estuaries in the world. And this is a little bit like saying like you have the world's best coffee. To my knowledge, there's not been a definitive study that really compares the number of invasive species across estuaries globally. But what we do know is that we have several studies that really document how invaded our system is. So we really do know that we have a really high load of invasive species in the San Francisco Bay Delta estuary. So some of the invasive species of the Delta specifically, of which there are, we think, at least 200 non-native species in the Bay Delta ecosystem. Not necessarily are all of these invasive species, meaning non-native species that would come in and cause harm, but we do know we have this large mix within our system of non-native species. And these fall into several general bins. First, we have a whole lot of floating and submerged aquatic plants that have invaded the system. So this is things like ribbonweed, which is shown in the top left. We have quite a few emergent terrestrial plants, such as rhododendron or giant reed, shown in the top right, and also yellow flag iris, which the last expert series, which was given by Anita, focused on. We also have invasive invertebrate species such as New Zealand mud snails shown in the bottom left, and these are quite minute, but still a problematic invader. And then we have the vertebrate invasive species such as the northern water snake, and these, for example, these northern water snake can come in and prey on native species, so causing disruption. So these invasive species can have lots of different impacts in the Delta system. So they can do things like disrupt boating and recreation. So in this image to the left, you have a channel and a boat trying to verse a channel that is really densely invaded by water hyacinths. So obviously it's going to be really difficult to navigate that channel. These invasive species can sometimes cause damage to infrastructure. So the arundo that we talked about in the previous slide, that can grow on levees, which are important in the system for managing flooding and managing the movement of water. So that damage can be a big problem. Invasive species can change food web structure, like the example we gave previously of the invasive snake. They can alter ecological conditions, which can impact invasive species. So if we again take the example of the picture to the left, the environment in the water underneath that dense mat of invasive plants is probably going to be quite different than an area that is less densely populated by a native species of floating aquatic vegetation. So the light might be different, the habitat structure might be different, and all that might impact the native species that live there. And finally, there is a whole lot of cost associated with the long-term control and management of invasive species once they enter the system. So because we know invasion is such a widespread, complex, and impactful problem in the Delta, in 2013, the Delta Interagency Invasive Species Coordination Team was formed to bring together groups from the Delta that work on detection, prevention, and management of invasive species or the restoration of invaded habitats. And conservancy staff have historically facilitated this group, along with co-chairs from the Delta Stewardship Council, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Department of Water Resources. And all the rest of the work that I'm going to talk about in this presentation comes from the work that this DIISC team has performed together over the years, and also the individual activities that different members of the DIISC team perform just as part of their day-to-day work. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all the members of the DIISC team, particularly the co-chairs, which I already spoke about, but also the Division of Boating and Waterways, which is a program in the California State Parks Department, and the Nutria Eradication Program for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which I'm going to discuss at different points of this presentation. So the DIISC team has three major types of activities that we participate in order to meet our goals of better managing and controlling invasive species in the system. First, we exchange information formally through quarterly meetings and other venues, and also informally just through our team network. And we work together to leverage funding, which is usually in service of fulfilling research or management needs that we've identified together. And one of these identified management needs that the DIISC team knew needed some focus in the system was early detection and rapid response to invasive species, specifically invasive species that come into what we might consider our wildland or non-agricultural systems. So early detection and rapid response to invasive species in agricultural systems is historically been more developed in the region than responding to new invasive species that are outside of the agricultural system, even though there's obviously spillover between those two types of habitats. So what is early detection and rapid response as a concept? Well, essentially, it's a coordinated set of actions that aims to find and report and then eradicate potential invasive species before they can spread and cause harm. And this is where we start to think of some of those applied ecological concepts that I talked about at the beginning when I was sort of introducing myself, because the best way I've found to really think about the importance of early detection and rapid response is to look at the classic invasion curve that we learn in invasion ecology, which I'm about to walk you through in the graphic to the right. So on the y-axis here, we have the spatial extent of the invasive species, and on the x-axis, we have time. So in the first portion of the invasion cycle, which is known as colonization, the invasive species is really at a limited spatial extent. And we think of this as our EDRR window of opportunities. This is our best chance at eradicating the invasive species in a cost-effective and timely manner, because the invasive species is at these really low spatial extents, so small population sizes. However, because these population sizes are small, the issue here often is detection. Like, how do we know when these invasive species have started to establish in our system? The next phase of the invasion is establishment. And this is an area where eradication is really possible, but it takes a large effort and a large commitment of resources, because during this time, the spatial extent of the invasive species is rapidly increasing. So it's possible to get in there and eradicate, but you're going to have to be much more aggressive because of the rapid spread of the species. And then finally, after the establishment phase, we come into the spread phase, where we see that the invasive species continues to spread across the system. And as managers, this is where our focus tends to shift from the idea of containing and eradicating an invasive species to controlling and managing the impacts of that invasive species. So once a species is in the system to a certain extent, it can be really difficult to actually eradicate it. So what you're doing is accruing costs over the long-term management of this species. And this is also during the spread phase when a public awareness typically begins, which is part of the important thing about public awareness, because the public can really be a valuable partner in identifying these early spread locations of invasive species, especially folks who have been out in the system, like hunters and fishers, who really see the change that invasive species can bring. They notice when the plant populations change, for example. So increasing public awareness of these earlier phases can be really important. So when we're talking about early detection and rapid response, what we're really talking about are all the actions that we can take during this highlighted time period after the introduction of a novel invader in order to eradicate them before they can spread and cause harm. So now that we all understand a little bit more about EDRR and what it intends to accomplish, we can look at some key elements of a successful EDRR program. So here we have listed some of the key elements of an EDRR framework or an EDRR program, which are preparedness, early detection, rapid assessment, and rapid response. And this framework is based on the National Early Detection Rapid Response Framework, which was put forward by the Department of the Interior back in 2016. And we also drew from a 2020 special issue of Biological Invasions, which focused on EDRR. So in setting the stage for a more comprehensive EDRR approach in our region, one of the things that we really realized in our research was that to make parts of the EDRR process function well together, what we need is adequate information and planning going into all of these 4 stages of the EDRR process. Because then you can give information to authoritative decision makers, so people who actually have the ability to act in a really timely manner and effectively coordinate across different actors in order to actually rapidly respond and eradicate an invasive species before it causes harm. So the first step from the DIISC team's perspective of setting ourselves up so that we could increase the effectiveness of our response was to have a central place where we could get some of this information. So really knowing what resources we had that were already available in our system. So the Delta is a really complex region when it comes to natural resource management, meaning there are a lot of different actors involved in all different aspects of managing the system. And what this also means is that there are lots of groups that are already working on parts of the EDRR process. So the DIISC team wanted to bring together all these different work that was already being done in the system into a central data set so that we could all know what everyone else was doing. And what we really found is that there are a lot of EDRR resources, which I'm going to show you summarized in this table based on the different steps in the EDRR framework, so preparedness, early detection, rapid assessment, and rapid response. But some of these programs were really siloed by working on specific species. So really excellent information, but only about a few key species that were either already in the system or that we're very concerned would enter the system. And people were also siloed by their legal jurisdiction. So for state and federal agencies, where do you actually have the legal ability to perform any sort of invasive species control? And that uncertainty maybe about who's supposed to be leading these efforts and in which parts of their jurisdiction can sometimes slow our response when a novel invader comes onto the scene. So a working group of DIISC team members met and used their expert knowledge of the Delta and its existing EDRR activities to create a data set that showed all the different resources for EDRR in the Delta. And what we found was that we have a lot of information and resources available for preparedness and early detection of species, but far fewer resources for rapid assessment and rapid response. Similarly, we found that there were many agencies that were involved in current EDRR activities in the Delta, but our ability to rapidly assess and also to rapidly respond is concentrated in a fewer number of actors. So maybe fewer people have the resources or the authority to actually take action when an invasive species enters the scene. So now that we know a lot more about how many different EDRR activities there are across the Delta, we can start to think about how what we have can feed into this overall process and start to look through some of the examples of what we already have existing out there on the system. And one thing that folks often ask when we're talking about early detection and rapid response is what's the role of prevention? So, we can rapidly assess and early detect, but why don't we just really focus on keeping new invasive species out of the system by preventing them from coming into the first place? Well, prevention, we feel, should really inform the EDRR process overall, but sort of exists outside this EDRR framework. But prevention really is critical to the success of any invasive species management program. So this is not just because long-term management of invasive species is extremely costly. So even if you aren't able to eradicate a species and you have to manage it long-term, but also multiple prevention efforts across California benefit the Delta. So there are some prevention efforts that are happening that really already apply to our region. So that's regulations around ballast water discharge that are coming from the state lands agencies, plant nursery inspections. So going to nursery facilities and checking to see if they are selling known invasive species as part of the horticultural trade. Border checkpoints within the state of California. So you've probably driven through those if you've ever traveled in and out of the state. And those are mostly looking for agricultural invasive species. And those are run through the California Department of Food and Agriculture. And also boater education and checkpoints. So things run mostly by the California state parks that try to educate boaters and anglers about not transporting invasive species. And there are lots of ways the public can help with prevention activities as well. So you can learn a lot about the invasive species that could impact your area. So just being informed so that if you see something, you're able to actually say, hey, I think this is an invasive species and report it to the appropriate folks. Don't be a vector of invasive species introduction by doing things like cleaning your gear and your boats in between uses. Think critically about the species that are purchased to plant around your home. So really not trying to focus on planting perhaps native species, or at least avoiding known invasive species. And finally, not releasing pets into the natural system. So for example, the invasive red-eared slider is a big problem in California because of continued introduction by people releasing pets. So now that we've addressed the importance of prevention, we can start to talk about the different key elements of the EDRR process. The first one of which is preparedness, which is going to feed into all the other aspects of the EDRR process. And we define preparedness, or the Department of the Interior defined preparedness as activities to establish plans, map and coordinate communication networks, develop tools, trainings, and resources that are necessary for EDRR actions. So basically, it's setting ourselves up for success with plans about how we're going to respond and how we're going to work together to provide this response. And a really good example of preparedness in the Delta system is the State Parks Division of Boating and Waterways. So this is the primary organization responsible for aquatic invasive plant control in the Delta and in Sassoon Marsh. And what they've done is developed these internal collaborative guidelines for Delta aquatic invasive plant control. So very specific to aquatic invasive plants. But what they've done is they've crosswalked other important policy and planning documents with invasive plant control efforts in the Delta so that they can preemptively understand how their work interacts with these other efforts that are going on with other groups, and how they might collaborate with those other groups in the case of a new invasive species or for just their work controlling existing invasive species. And the collaborative guidelines have these 9 key objectives, and they are listed here on the left-hand side. And this image on the right-hand side, I think, really demonstrates the extent of the problem that the Department of Boating and Waterways is tackling in the Delta. So aquatic invasive plants are really widespread, as we discussed earlier, and you can see this is just a big mat of invasive alligator weed in the Delta. But these first 4 objectives of the Division of Boating and Waterways collaborative guidelines, which are coordination and collaboration, prevention, early detection and monitoring, and rapid response and eradication, are clearly EDRR related activities where the group has made a plan, not just for how they will accomplish these activities, but also how they will work with other groups in the system to accomplish their goals. So this is a really excellent example of how you can have just a planning document that can make you more prepared for a novel invasive species introduction. We'll move on next from preparedness to early detection. And early detection coordinates monitoring activities. So the initial occurrence of a potentially invasive species is really quickly reported, and the species identity is verified. So not just that you're reporting that you think you've seen an invasive species, but also that we have an authoritative identity on that species, and we can confirm, yes, this is an invasive species we should be concerned about. And a really great example of this is the weed management areas in California. So weed management areas are local stakeholder collaborations which focus on invasive plant control efforts. And they're also often coordinated by the county agricultural commissioners' offices, but in some cases they're coordinated by the resource conservation districts which are spread across California. So essentially these are stakeholder collaborations at the county level across California. So thinking a little bit more locally. And these are funded through the California Department of Food and Agriculture. And these groups come together and they set regional goals and targets. So they know which species they should be looking out for in their region that might come in and become invasive. So in the image to the right here, we have an Instagram post from the YOLO Resource Conservation District, which is promoting the weed management area's EDRR activities. So here they are saying, we are really concerned about the introduction and spread of Russian knapweed. So if you have Russian knapweed, and then they give some resources on how to identify it, and some resources on who to contact and potential steps for control of this weed if you see it on your lands, either the lands you manage or for private landowners who are sometimes involved in these resource conservation districts and weed management areas, it can help them respond on their lands as well. And the public can also be really, really helpful in early detection, which we were talking about previously when we were going through that invasion curve. So some of the ways that the public can really help with early detection are the simple thing of, if you see something and you think it might be a species that is, you've been hiking in an area, for example, for a really long time and you've never seen this species before, and over the last couple of years, it's really started to pop up everywhere, then that might be an invasive species. So you can report that sighting of a potential invasive species if you're a land manager or a landowner through your weed management area coordinators. Or if you're a member of the public, there's a couple different apps for your phone where you can report invasive species. So you can report agricultural pests to the California Department of Food and Agriculture through their Report a Pest phone app. And you can report wildland invaders to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife through their EdMaps app. And there's a specific EdMaps for California. So if you are looking up that in the App Store, make sure you choose the one that's preloaded with species from California. And both of these are going to alert the state agencies of this sighting, and potentially then, if there's a positive identification of an invasive species, result in eradication activities. So a really important way to engage with the process. Next, we can move on to rapid assessment. So once early detection has happened and we have a positive identity, we know that we have a new invasive species in the system, rapid assessment is used to determine the distribution and abundance of the species, evaluate its potential risks to the environment, health, and the economy, and identify options for rapid response. And rapid response, likewise, helps to coordinate actions to eradicate a new potential invasive species before it becomes established and eradication is no longer feasible. So it's really important once we detect a new invasive species and have a positive identity to quickly move through these last two steps of the EDRR process so that we can actually eradicate the species. And a really good example of a rapid assessment and rapid response is the invasion of nutria in California at large. So these are large semi-aquatic rodents that are native to South America, and they occupy fresh and brackish waters generally. And in 1889, these were introduced to the US for the fur trade. But in the 1970s, they were declared eradicated in California. So there was an eradication effort, and we said, okay, we did it. But in 2017, a population of nutria was rediscovered at a managed wetland in Merced County. And since 2018, they've been found in several other counties across California, including San Joaquin County, which is a county in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And these nutria can have lots of different impacts. They consume a lot of vegetation. They eat like somewhere around 25% of their body weight daily, but they're really messy eaters. So they destroy about 10% more vegetation than they actually consume. And so if this is native vegetation, that can be a problem because it, changes the habitat structure of the native plant community. But for invasive plants, honestly, this can be a problem too, because that messy eating can result in invasive plant parts moving to different parts of the system in the waterway and becoming established in new locations. In addition, their burrowing into levees can really damage the infrastructure. And all these things can impact the streams and rivers in the system in lots of different ways. So because of these known impacts of nutria, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife was able to really quickly go through their rapid assessment process because we knew that a lot about this invasive species because it had been in the system before, and we knew a lot about the negative impacts that it could have, and thus we knew we needed to act quickly to avoid those negative impacts. So the California Department of Fish and Wildlife leads the nutria eradication and the early detection rapid response. And they do this work by using searching grids. So these are 40-acre grid cells laid out across the landscape, which you can see in the map to the right. And they search these grid cells using boats, kayaks, they walk, they drive around if there's accessible roads. And they're not just looking for individual nutria that they might spot. They're also looking for scat, tracks, any visual signs that nutria might have been in the system. And then they also have game cameras and platforms set up around the system. And because we were able to rapidly assess and then rapidly put resources into a response for nutria, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has reported that nutria take, so the amount of nutria that they are removing from the system, dropped by nearly half between 2020 and 2021, even though they were increasing the area that they were surveying. So not just were they looking in more areas, but they were looking in more areas and they were continually finding less and less individuals of the species, which means they're making progress toward eradication, which is really exciting because of the known negative impacts of these species. But in order to have this really effective rapid response, there had to be a whole lot of partners involved. This was led by CDFW, but funded and permitted and implemented by many different other organizations. So this is a really excellent example of how this EDRR process can work and work effectively in the case of a new species or a species that we thought was eradicated being reintroduced or coming back. So just a few conclusions here that I'd like to put forward. So first, all these efforts require really proactive coordination and communication among different sectors. So the public, different scientists working for state and federal agencies, as well as invasive species managers at the site level. Invasion prevention is also most effective for both preventing ecological harm and conserving monetary resources, but early detection and rapid response are key if prevention isn't possible. And all of this work really involves understanding the ecology of the different invasive species that come into the system, the ecology of the system itself, and also just understanding general invasion biology and invasion ecology and applying all those aspects to how we can actually solve or attempt to solve this problem of invasive species in the system. So with that, I'll just pop up my slide here with my information. Feel free to find me on the internet, and I will take any questions that folks might have.
Thank you for the presentation, Rachel. I do have a question. Because like obviously you were mentioning like the nutria, there was like a lot of stakeholders, you know, who got involved in trying to remove the nutria. Have you noticed that for some particulars, like some species, it might be more difficult to try to get more stakeholders to remove that species?
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on how much we already know about the impacts of the invasive species as far as like how quickly action can take place. So if we know that there's going to be really impacts to infrastructure, for example, I think with the nutria is really important. So their burrows can really impact levee stability, which impacts public safety, among many other things. So that's we know that's really important, and thus the state will quickly divert the state and federal government lots of resources to addressing that problem. If it's something that we're like less sure about what the impacts are, or we're even like less sure that a species might become a problematic invader, like maybe it's just an introduced species and it's going to exist in the system and not really like cause very many problems, or it can hang out in the system for a little while and then like all of a sudden like begin to spread and cause ecological harm. So I think, you know, just it's really hard to get people to act, or people are less quick to act when there are more unknowns. So I think it depends a little bit on just like how much we know about the impacts. I see Chloe's hand.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Hopefully it doesn't glitch out a little bit. So awesome talk. I'm working at the Huntington Beach Wetlands Conservancy right now, and we have like a huge Russian thistle problem. And so I was wondering if there's any like resources you could direct me to. Like, do you guys have any issues or present or like reports that you've done having to deal with Russian thistle? And or if not, like, you know, where can I go to figure out how we can best deal with that problem and like prevent regrowth of Russian thistle?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is definitely Russian thistle in the Delta, but as far as resources for how to deal with it, I would direct you to the California Invasive Plant Council. So Cal-IPSC, they have, for a lot of the major invasive plants in California, they have little reports, or not little, like they have reports that they've written, but they're short reports. You know, they're very easily digestible.
Perfect.
And they'll have it in there things like, you know, known impacts to the ecology, and also in some cases like treatment suggestions, like in which systems and which different treatments might work. I would also direct you to your local weed management area if there is one. So I think you can Google weed management area California, and then I know there's a couple in Southern California, but I don't know how active they are. But if they have a website and they have a contact email, I think that could get you to a person who would be able to help you with that. Yeah, so I think those would be my like top two suggestions for specifically looking for information about certain species, and definitely if it's an invasive plant species, the California Invasive Plant Council, I think, has a really useful website with a lot of information about different invasive plants and how to manage them.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah.
Cody, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, sorry, you might have already answered this. I came in a little bit late. But I was wondering, are there any I know there's like monitoring and whatnot going on for native species, or I mean for invasive species to like go out and see them. Are there any regulations or like protocols put in place for movements of invasive and like pest species due to like changes from climate change?
Man, that's such a good question. So for species, I think it's a nuanced question too. So the first question there is, for species that are coming from outside the system, so weren't historically present in California, could their ranges change because of climate change? I think definitely yes. I don't know of any specific, I'm sure there are folks who are monitoring certain species and how they're responding to climate change and their potential spread. There have been several studies recently in the Delta looking at climate suitability, sort of looking at, okay, what is the climate conditions that this species thrives in? What are the predicted climate conditions in our region in the future? And does that increase or decrease the area of opportunity for this invasive species? So if you want to follow up with me via email, I can send you a link to those papers. And
Yeah,
then as far as the like regulations, I would say nothing particular that comes to mind. I think if things are moving across jurisdictional boundaries, that's when things can start to get like a little bit complicated. If a species is moving into a system, I don't know, I'm going to make up a weird example, but like a private land is like a thing that often comes up. So if you have a species that's expanding onto a privately owned area, you as the state or federal government obviously don't just have the authority to go in there and treat it. You have to work with the landowner and make sure that they are also interested and invested in treating and controlling that species. And then I think another part of that question, which I'm not sure was exactly what you're intending to ask, is just the change in range of native species that might occur as the result of climate change. So where native species are perhaps, more robust and generalist native species, maybe going into systems where they were previously not able to hang out because of, environmental constraints that are no longer there because of climate change, and how we deal with that. I think that's a very much an open question, both in like invasion ecology and also in natural resource management. I think it's going to be something we have to think about more and more in the coming years.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd love to read those papers.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions for Rachel?
Thank you all very much for your attention on a Saturday morning. I appreciate you tuning in.
Yes. Okay. So I think we don't have any more questions, but you do have some comments on the chat saying thank you for the talk and great presentation. And again, thank you guys for joining in. I know it's like kind of a Saturday morning. But thank you guys for coming in and listening to Rachel's talk. So it's always very nice to be able to have someone with such experience, especially with invasive species, and being a wetland ecologist. Yay! So thank you very much. If you guys don't have any other questions, you guys are free to go, and hopefully you guys could be able to join us next month for our next talk. And thank you again, Rachel, for joining today.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome.